Okay, I think we're up to video number 12 now, talking about cults. Just a brief overview. I was in a cult for 20 years, wasted 20 years of my life. It wasn't all bad. There were good times, there were bad times. But yeah, I've spoken about that. So I want to talk about control techniques in cults, yeah, and how we can observe control, if you like, even in animals, or tribes, or simpler forms of life, shall we say. A cat can hiss at you, or another cat. Dogs can bark angrily, or a cat could purr. A dog could pant and sort of smile at you. People have pets, but sometimes people say, you can train a dog, but a cat will train you, kind of thing. But it is this essence of control. How does a cat keep away another cat from its territory? It might hiss, it might scratch. It will do whatever it can do. We see this in nature, in all kinds of creatures, maybe fighting over territory. There's some good food, so they try and chase the other animals away. Baboons have wars, apparently. But fighting over territory, food, a mate, protecting young, these are all things that are actually useful to observe when we consider the more sophisticated techniques of control that cults use. It is that we see it in nature, right? But the techniques used in a cult, they're very devious. Let's talk about Bible-based cults. Christian-based cults. That's what my experience was. When a leader says, well, you can go to hell if you don't do X, Y, and Z, or if you do X, Y, and Z, you'll go to hell. Now, hell is a concept. Probably about half the world believe in this thing called hell and heaven, right? About half the world. Abrahamic religion, some other religions as well, nirvana, paradise, they have different names for it. And basically, it's a really, really frightening place, or a really, really desirable place. Yeah. Now, when we look at cults, we could consider groups like Al-Qaeda and the events of 9/11 and the World Trade Center, which was 25 years ago, September the 11th, 2001, roughly. And those cult members were manipulated and motivated to fly planes into skyscrapers, killing people, innocent people, and they thought their reward as a martyr would be to get 72 virgins. To some people that sounds absolutely ridiculous, absolutely insane. But we're talking about cults. So we are talking about insane, unproven ideologies. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. When I look back, I could see that, yes, I would have been vulnerable to a cult, and it was quite easy to convert me because I was raised a Catholic. I believed in the idea of a God and a devil and a heaven and hell, angels and demons, sin and righteousness. Those things had been taught to me, and I believed these concepts, and that is all they are, is concepts. And so it was very easy to manipulate me to go from being in a Catholic church. I'd kind of stopped going I found it boring. But then it was very easy for, I guess you'd call it a Protestant cult, to recruit me. Because I already believed in God and heaven and all of that stuff. I believed in the Bible. I didn't know much about the Bible, but some people will join a cult quicker than others. You know, other people might be, loved into a cult. The cult gives them a lot of love, a lot of friendship. If they're on drink or drugs or whatever, yeah, you can overcome this, and we've got a program for helping you overcome drugs or whatever. And they show the person a lot of love, but it's not love without strings attached. There's conditions to it, that the person will join the group and serve the agenda of the group, which the group pretends will be God's agenda, something like that. So even in animals or birds, even in nature, we see control mechanisms. A poisonous snake. Evolution has produced a snake that is poisonous, and that will scare off other creatures. So the mechanism of control is in nature. You eat something poisonous, you might die. Unless you're religious and you think you can eat poisonous things and not die. Many a cult member has died thinking they can do supernatural things. But yeah, basically the real point I want to make is cults are about control, and they're about methods, techniques, processes, indoctrination, right? Yeah. And nobody would just sit and be indoctrinated. So it's a very crafty process where when I got recruited, and I've mentioned this, they're all friendly. But they're friendly because they think they're saving my soul, right? They're not friendly for the sake of, well, let's just go down the pub and have a chat about whatever. They're friendly, but they're friendly to lure somebody in to the cult. That's why they're friendly. And a lot of them are very sincere about it. They really think, because they've been programmed to think that way, that they're saving your soul from hell. And you can't go to any other church or be part of any religion, any other religion, to be saved. So the control, is really what you got to think about. I mean, somebody could say to somebody, right, you're going to go to hell. Now, if I'm an atheist or an agnostic, it means nothing. It's an empty threat. But if you're religious and somebody says, well, you might go to hell, you might pay attention, and you might say to them, well, why is that? What do I have to do? Because you're frightened. Again, going back to nature. If you're in a forest and there's a noise, the default programming could be dangerous. Maybe it's a bear or a tiger. The human instinct to survive, that could be dangerous. It might be your wife. Very dangerous. But, it might be something nice or it might be something nasty. But, the default nature, survival of the fittest kind of thing, evolution, we protect ourselves against danger, and we are drawn to pleasure, whether it's sexual pleasure or loads of money. For lots of people, seems to be the only thing they're bothered about. Narcissistic feed for some people, being in control, telling other people what to do, drugs, drink, sexual immorality, whatever. But the heaven and the hell thing means nothing to, an agnostic or an atheist. But if somebody says, well, you're just going to end up a drug addict, for somebody else who's sensitive to that, that can be used as a mechanism of control to manipulate that person. A lot of people are vulnerable to flattery. You know, with cult recruitment, people are vulnerable to love and friendship and a sense of belonging and purpose and spiritual answers. Yeah. So different people are vulnerable in different ways to these manipulative, controlling things. It's like, are you interested in God? Yeah, okay, yeah, I'll do a Bible study then. And then it's like, later on comes the other side of the control. Oh, I thought you were interested in God. Why don't you want to do a Bible study then? So it's subtle, and it's very effective, the sort of psychological manipulation. Because people fear all sorts of things. They fear being alone, they fear not having money, they fear death. And people can come along and say, well, don't worry if you die, you know, if you give us money and insurance, we'll take care of the next generation, you know, and then whether it's an economic scam or whatever it is. So let me just press pause 1 minute. Right, so where I've put here, if you do what the leader wants, then you go to heaven. I mean, this is the concept of Abrahamic religion. And the leader, of course, represents God. A teacher, a prophet, even people who claim to be a Messiah. Some cult leaders claim to be the second coming of Christ or a Jewish Messiah or something like that. So the leader, self-appointed leader, schizophrenic leader maybe, narcissistic, pretty much certain, they are the representative. And even in the Bible it says, you know, you are God's ambassadors. But don't let the title ambassador go to your head. This is the thing. Because then people can just, certainly in cults, they just lose the plot. They think God's talking to them, or they got a special message from the Bible, and then it goes to their head and their ego, and then they feel they've got a right or responsibility from God to have to make everybody else believe whatever they believe is true. It also comes down, as I've mentioned several times, if you want to get married in a cult, well, it's not just you find somebody you fancy and get on with it. You know, you have to, the relationship has to be approved by a leader. So if you're not serving the cult, then you won't get married. And the sickest twist of all is when cult leaders say they're actually serving the group, but the group is serving the leader. So, you know, they twist things on their head. Some leaders like to be adored. You know, some leaders are trying to create a happy environment to replace the emptiness in their life. Maybe they had abuse when they were younger, and then they try and create this fantasy environment, and if people don't act a certain way, as I mentioned last Sunday's London ICC sermon, you know, they get angry with the congregation for not being the way that the leader has the sort of fantasy of what a church should be like. And control is like a drug. This is the thing. I mean, I sometimes look at these cult leaders and they got the glazed over eyes as if they're on something. They are on something. Control, you know, and money, and telling other people what to do. That is their drug, you know. And when you have the cult environment, then they can filter out the people who they can get to obey them and get rid of all the people who walk away or leave or whatever. And that intensifies the effect of the drug of control. So they almost poison themselves with their own ego. So there you go. I hope this video is useful.